beginners, it can be kind of hard to pick out what kind of handsaw you need. Whether or not you want to get a Japanese style or a Western one. Sometimes you already have one from Granddad lying around, or maybe something like this. Now, each one of these serves a different purpose in my shop, though one of them can do all of the other's tasks, and we'll get to that here in a minute. But before we do that, let me show you how they cut, what it looks like, and maybe whether or not you just have what you need already. Let's start with this one here. A lot of you probably have one of these lying in the back of your shed great-granddad left to you. A lot of folks still prefer these saws because unlike modern saws, they can easily be sharpened. They're made out of 1095 spring steel, unhardened. This particular one was made by the Warrened Superior Company, which began in 1921. I don't believe this one is that old. Then again, I don't exactly know whether or not great-granddad was the first owner. Now you'll see here that it leaves a pretty fine cut on the crosscut, but a rather ragged and rough ripping cut. A part of that could be that I have relatively dull teeth because personally I'm not all that skilled with sharpening them, and I don't have a saw set vise, so the only way I can set the teeth is by putting it up against a piece of softwood and hitting every other tooth in order to produce the kerf we want. Now, the reason these are so much easier to sharpen is because of that unhardened 1095 steel. All the other saws I have here are unsharpenable, either because they have a very complicated tooth pattern or they're impulse hardened. These saws can usually be had for $20 to $75 on Marketplace or Craigslist. And if resharpening is a big deal to you, this is the only real option there is out there. So, let's move on to its, I suppose, great-grandson, the modern Western crosscut saw. This particular one here is 14 inches. It was a gift from my grandfather, and you'll see it produces a much finer rip and crosscut than the older saw. That's most likely because it's sharper rather than any difference in the tooth pattern. But, unlike the older saw, I can't sharpen this one because all these little teeth here are impulse hardened, meaning they were hooked up to an electrode and heated extremely rapidly before being quenched. That hardened the steel, so even though this is still 1095, it's a lot stiffer, and these teeth are harder than any file I've ever found. And I don't believe they make stones that can fit between the teeth. If you're looking for something new or you don't want to deal with waiting to find something on Marketplace, these can be had for $10 to $20 for a pretty decent one from Menards or Home Depot. Don't go to Lowe's. They're going to charge you $20 to $30. The handles on both these saws are still the old wood ones, but they can come with aluminum or polymer handles. Some people like that, but the wood's easier to replace, and it feels better to my hands. Now, we'll move on to a more fine woodworking saw that's designed to be used with a miter box. This is a back saw, and I may have misspoken earlier. I'm not certain if this one can be hardened or if these teeth are impulse hardened. You probably can't even see them on the camera. I might have to get a close-up here in a minute. But they're exceptionally fine. And that became a bit of a problem when we did our ripping cut. I can see it here. It produced the finest ripping cut out of any of these saws, even than the dedicated ripping blade on the next saw we're going to talk about. But it was nearly impossible for me to deal with ripping because of this nice stiff back piece of steel you have on it. This one's also a Warren Superior, which means it's going to be a little bit newer than the old brass backs you see in a lot of videos. But just like this one here, you can have it for $20 to $30 on Marketplace, though these are a bit harder to come by. If you want to buy a new one, it's going to be $10 to $20, and they usually come with a miter box. I don't have one here, otherwise I'd demonstrate it. But those miter boxes you get are going to be cheap plastic and are going to have quite a bit of slop. The next one we're going to look at is the one that you're probably going to want if you don't have any of these saws already. And that is the Japanese Ryoba. This one here is made by Kiri. I don't believe it's actually made in Japan. The handle might be, but I know for a fact the blade is a Chinese steel. And for the money, these are about the best you can get, unless you're looking to get used. Unlike these saws, you'll notice that it had two sets of teeth when we did our test. One finer set for cross-cutting and a rougher set for ripping. That means the ripping cut isn't actually the finest ripping cut we have, but it was a lot easier to make that ripping cut, especially because of the form factor. It's designed to be used with two hands rather than one. And you'll notice our crosscut was one of the finest, if not the finest. This particular handle is wrapped with some sort of plastic or polymer and hot glued on. I don't particularly like that, but the handle's made of beech. I bought this saw for $14 on sale from Amazon. You can have a similar one for normal price, usually about $20 to $30. As far as which one to get, I actually wouldn't recommend getting the Kiri because, again, of that Chinese steel. If you're going to be paying full price, surprisingly enough, the Irwin brand one has Italian-made steel and blades, though you don't get that nice beech handle. As far as sharpening these go, as I alluded to earlier, for a non-professional, it's nearly impossible. In addition to the cross-cutting side being impulse hardened, just like this saw here, and any of the new saws with a back you buy, the ripping teeth are still much too fine for any files I own or can find. However, these have a big advantage over these two when you're talking about the impulse hardened teeth. Replacement blades are available for these, both Japanese and Chinese steels. I'm not certain about the Italian or German ones you can find sometimes. I've never seen replacement blades for those, though I do believe they use the same replacement standard, I guess, which you can kind of see a little bit here. I'll have to try and get a close-up, where you have a single bolt that removes, and you can slot the new blade in between these two pieces of sheet metal. Because of the versatility and superior form factor, this is most likely the saw you want to get if you're going to be trying to get into woodworking. However, there are a few downsides. The teeth do not begin at the ends of the blades like they do on the rest of these Western saws. Instead, you're going to end up with a little chunk that can't cut at either end. That means you can't do a plunge cut very easily. That's made up somewhat, but from the fact that you can make a flush cut because of how much thinner this is, because it's using a pulling motion. You can bend the blade and press it up against the wood while still making a sawing motion. Whereas with these saws, that would bend the saw and you'd have to bend it back and it'd be a whole mess. I'll leave links below to examples of all these saws except for the vintage one here. Now, let's move on to the kind of saws you're going to be using outdoors. And cut Hammond. Now, onto the outdoor saw. You can see there's a bit of an elephant in the room. You probably don't need one of these. That doesn't change that I'm glad to own it, and it doesn't change that I'm going to show it off. This here is, I believe, about 100 years old, and it's exceptionally easy to sharpen. If those two things aren't your reason you're buying a saw, you're better off with any of these other ones. This is really a logger saw that's been completely superseded by the modern gas chainsaw. And from the looks of it, maybe electric ones going forward. These old buck saws can be had for around $50 to $100. But you probably don't need one if you're watching this video. So let's not waste too much time on it. Let's get this one out of the way. Now, onto the saws that you might actually need. All three of these are relatively available at big box stores. The bow saw here is probably the one you're most familiar with. You might have grown up using one of these. And then we also have the two Japanese style, both the non-folding and the folding. Insofar as the bow saw, one of its biggest advantages is size. However, there are Japanese saws that can somewhat compare. It's quite difficult to find one that's got a full 22-inch blade. And speaking of those blades, like the Japanese carpentry saws, these are replaceable. They can be typically had for around $4 or $5 at the Tractor Supply or whatever big box store you prefer. And the bow saws themselves typically sit around $20. That's not too bad for what you get, and you saw it made a pretty nice cut. However, it does have the problem of binding quite easily because there's no real kerf to these blades. That's not to say there's none, but it's not aggressive enough for cross-cutting rough, not even lumber, rough logs. So for a lot of folks, while these used to be the bee's knees, we've moved on to the Eastern style saws like these. And when you move on to the Eastern style, you really have two options: non-folding and folding. And I'm going to say they have two different purposes where they're going to be the best choice. If you're going to be using this saw for pruning trees around the yard or using a bigger one for cutting firewood, you definitely want to be getting the non-folding option. This one here was $2, and I'm not kidding. I'm going to leave a link to this down below. They might be all gone by the time I do, but $2 at Menards. And you saw it left about the same cut quality as this one here. There are much longer ones, and I'll leave a link to each of the big box stores where they'll have one of their longer curved models. That didn't happen. And then you have your second option, which is the folding saw. I really only think this is the best choice if you're going to be using it for camping. While the folding option is very convenient, it causes you to have a much worse form factor as far as how you hold it. Now, this one could be used with two hands, but when you're doing pruning operations, you really only want to use one. And this saw is not optimized for that. It's optimized for two hands, or not using it all, I guess. This particular one is pretty good. However, instead of leaving a link to specific models, I'm going to leave a link down below to Project Farm's video where he recently did a comparison of, I believe, 10 of these saws. His conclusion was not that this one was the best one. However, it was definitely in the top 5. Now, I hope you found this information useful. If not, well, I'm sorry I didn't help you. But if you did, maybe you could let me know what you want to see in the future, and I hope you all have a good day. God bless. Hammond walked away instead of cutting it.